Hi, thank you. My name is Roseanne. I'm actually a Senior Employment Relations Advisor with Employsure. So today we're going to go through some of the top questions that we get from our construction and trade business owners on a daily basis. So if I go through anything too quickly, please let me know. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to put those through so then we can get through them as we can. Okay, so just starting off now. So our first question is what takes precedence over the other contract or a policy? If I'm going through the slides too quickly, please let me know. So I suppose a contract will always take precedence over a policy, and contracts do provide certainty surrounding the obligations between you and your employee. Even if you don't have a written contract, a verbal contract will still exist between you and the employee. But the difficulty is if you don't have that written contract, it makes it more based on your custom and practice formed over time, and it can make terms ambiguous. So things like notice, possibly pays, and also if you don't have a written contract, we can't offset any payments above the minimum award rate to pay. Now with compliance, we do need to ensure that whenever we're putting on a new employee, you need to include a Fair Work information statement, as this is required under the Fair Work Act. Now, if a contract is not in place with an employee, we also have to assume that reasonable notice is required to be given to an employee. And if they're a non-award employee, that could be quite a substantial amount of time. And there have been cases that have said reasonable notice may be up to 6 months, depending on the position of that person in the business. So contracts ensure protection for your business. Modern awards protect employees. It's those minimum rights and entitlements for them, not for your protection as an employer. They're very important to protect your business interests, in regards to particularly confidentiality clauses, additional entitlements like company vehicles, mobile phones, and post-termination restraints. So the most important thing is setting those expectations very early with your employee by clearly communicating your expectations to them. And it also then provides the maximum chance of those employees meeting your expectations. If those are set right in the first instance, it's more likely that your employees are going to do the right thing, as they may not know what the right thing actually is. So contracts also allow that we can enforce those expectations because the expectations have been made clear from the start. So it makes it a lot easier to be able to discipline for matters of misconduct, and it also gives you a range of options to be able to address any breach of the contract, or of course your employee handbook or any policy that you have. So the reason why we don't recommend any policies to be included in your contract is because your contract is a legal obligation and they're legally enforceable in court. So, and contracts can't be varied or amended without agreement between both parties. Policies create a flexible option for employers to change expectations of employees as they're discretionary. So you may be required to consult with your employees, but you still have a greater ability to amend those to enable the effective functioning of your business. So an employee isn't required to agree to any of your policies or any changes to those as they're discretionary. And it's a lawful direction to be able to say that they must follow your policies. So policies, we don't recommend incorporating them into your contract because of their ability to be able to be changed. They're dynamic, and they can change a number of ways, in significant ways, over the life cycle of your business. So the benefit for you is if you've got them as a policy and they're standalone to your contract, that you can make changes to suit your business. Whereas if they're a contract, you would have to seek agreement from the employee in particular to make any of those changes. And we want to ensure that we don't expose your business to any kinds of claims or penalties if you don't adhere to those policies. So both documents have quite a significant amount of clout, but the contract itself creates the obligation to adhere to the policies, while your employee handbook will contain the details of the policies and procedures, which outlines those expectations for your employees. Okay, so the next question that we have is, do contracts have to include leave conditions, or can it refer to your company's leave policy? So your contract should refer to an employee's entitlement to leave. Specifically, for a full-time employee, it should state they receive 4 weeks of annual leave per annum and 10 days of personal or carers leave per annum. In the case of a casual employee, they don't have access to any paid annual leave or paid personal or carers leave. It's not wise, in our view, to include the terms on how to take leave in your actual contract, because we don't want to, and these are things like that you must submit an annual leave request form, or it must go to this person. And that's because if it's in the contract, as we said before, it's a legally binding document, and it would reduce your flexibility to change those requirements over time or to alter them. So the terms on how to take those leaves are more appropriately set out in your policy or your policy manual. So then if at any time there's ever a requirement in amendments or alterations, you could do that without having to seek the approval or agreement from your employees. Now, depending on policy changes, of course, you should communicate those to employees, and possibly in some circumstances some consultation may need to occur. However, with doing those things, you can still have that flexibility to change it to suit your business needs. Okay, so question 3, what are the factors I need to consider when calculating an all-purpose allowance? So, all-purpose allowances are included in an employee's base rate of pay. They are created in modern awards, and they're intended to compensate employees for industry and occupational specific challenges, and maintain the relativities across the modern award system. It's important to identify any all-purpose allowances your employees may be entitled to and ensure they are paid. To calculate the cumulative sum of the all-purpose allowances that may apply to your employees, you need to take a number of things into consideration. So you need to take into consideration their occupation, the nature of the work site, any license requirements, whether they use tools and equipment, whether it's their own tools and equipment for some awards, whether they may have leading hand, if they're a leading hand, or and any of their responsibilities. So, for example, if they're in charge of plant and machinery, and these all-purpose allowances are award specific. So, for you to remain compliant, it's necessary to ensure you know which ones are your all-purpose allowances, and if that's the right allowance for the role specified in the award, that would apply to that employee. Okay, so question 4. Are my employees entitled to any travel allowances? So travel is a question that we most certainly get quite often. So regarding builders, building and construction and plumbers, given frequent changes in work sites across the building and construction industry, the majority of employees are entitled to some form of compensation for travel. So calculating the correct amount of travel allowance in accordance with either the Building and Construction General On-Site Award or the applicable plumbing award will depend on several factors. So it will depend on the location of the work site. Is the employee transported to the work site, or do they use their own vehicle? And also whether the employee is required to live away from their residence. So even within small business, every project has its own distinct conditions. So the travel allowance will vary accordingly. It may not always be the same, as this will always be determined by the project and as well as the employee's category. So for electricians, employees are entitled to a travel allowance if their jobs meet, again, certain specifications. And these depend on three conditions: where they start and finish work, if they've offered transport by the employer, and if they make their own way to work. So they get, for a travel time allowance, they get paid $5.98 currently for each day on which they present themselves for work. And this allowance is also paid on their rostered days off. So for distance work and wages, employees are also compensated for starting and finishing work on a job site, and the amount that they receive will be dependent on the distance that they've travelled. Now, what you do need to note is that the vehicle allowance is only paid if the employee agrees with their employer to use their own vehicle, and the distance is travelled more than what the employee would usually have to travel. So for gardening and landscaping, employees in this industry or this sector are entitled to a travel allowance if their jobs meet certain, again, specifications and conditions, which are the employee is required to work away from their usual place of residence. The employer will provide reasonable board and lodging, or will they pay the cost of lodging. An employee who is required to work away from their usual place of employment will be compensated for the additional time spent on commuting. Employees are also entitled to travel or transport allowance when they've worked overtime, which finishes at a time when reasonable means of transportation is not available. So for painting and decorating, there's no travel mentioned, but if they were under that building and construction as a painter, they may get travel. It may depend on their award coverage. And for question 5, how does portable long service leave work? So in most industries, employees are entitled to long service leave if they've worked for that same employer for a prolonged period of time. And it's the state legislation that outlines the length of period of time that they have to work before getting access to long service leave. And it may differ from state to state. Now, because in the construction and building trades industry is mostly project-based, they may be covered by state-specific portable long service leave schemes. What this means is that employees aren't required to remain with the same employer for an extended period. Instead, they carry that service and accumulate it through time worked within the industry from employer to employer. So for business owners, what's most important is that you need to ensure, if your state has this scheme in place, that you need to be a registered employer and you need to register the employee to the scheme. And the scheme will outline your payments and whether they need to be regular payments. It may include paying a levy or seeking a reimbursement for contributions made to employees. It would just depend on the state and the scheme that's been outlined in that state. So question 6. Am I required to pay my employees annual leave loading? Okay, so across most of modern awards, there is an annual leave loading of 17.5% for when employees access or take a period of annual leave. And that's if they take one day or if they take their entire 4 weeks. The awards in this industry that most certainly do have annual leave loading are the Building and Construction General On-Site Award, Plumbing and Fire Sprinklers Award, Electrical, Electronic and Communications Contracting Award, and the Joinery and Building Trades Award. So how that 17.5% though varies from award to award. And for the Building and Construction Award, it requires that 17.5% annual leave loading to be calculated on the minimum wages, industry all-purpose allowance, inclusive of the underground allowance if that applies to your employee, tool and employee protection allowance if that applies to the employee, living away from home distant work if that applies to your employee, the fares and travel patterns allowance if it applies to your employee, and the leading hand allowance, again, if it applies. So the calculation itself can become quite complicated depending on what other allowances that may apply to that particular employee circumstance. Most certainly not a one-size-fits-all. So for some employers, they'll pay the annual leave loading when they take their annual leave, whereas others may include that annual leave loading into the employee's salary and pay them slightly higher for their salary base to sufficiently cover this. Both approaches are fine as long as the relevant way in which you're calculating or including that annual leave loading is communicated with the employee, and you need to have this reflected in their written employment contract. If you don't have this reflected in their employment contract, it could possibly result in an employee making an underpayment claim because they may believe they haven't actually been paid that leave loading. So annual leave loading, we also need to note, isn't only payable when an employee takes their paid annual leave. There's actually also a requirement under the Fair Work Act for any accrued annual leave to be paid out on termination as if it was taken, which means when you pay out that annual leave when they no longer work for you, you need to also apply that annual leave loading as if they'd actually taken that annual leave. Okay, so question 7 is, am I required to pay my employees on rain days? So the Building and Construction General On-Site Award does include inclement weather provisions. The award specifically defines inclement weather as the existence of rain or abnormal climatic conditions. This can include hail, extreme cold, high winds, severe dust storm, extreme high temperature, or a combination of those. Where it is not reasonable or it is unsafe for employees to continue to work in those conditions. When inclement weather conditions exist, employees should not work if it is not safe to do so. If or when an employee is not able to perform any work because of inclement weather, the employee will need to be paid at the ordinary rate of pay for their ordinary hours. So in that award, payments are subject to a maximum of 32 hours, pay in every 4-week period for each employee. So that does give a bit of respite in times like the wet season, as it is only limited to that 32 hours. There are other trade awards that may or that have inclement weather conditions, which would require you to pay when those conditions are present, are also the electrical, electronic and communications contracting award, and the plumbing and fire sprinklers award. So question 8, do I need to provide my employees with rostered days off? Okay, so under the building and construction industry, there is an RDO system in place. So you can work 40 hours per week, being that you're paid for 38, and you accrue 2 hours per week towards the 20th day in each 4-week cycle, and that being taken as RDO. The system is an opt-out system, so if your business is covered under the award, unless you agree with your employees to not have the RDO system in place, then it should be in operation. So some of the awards deal with how you do that a little bit differently, but you should always work that unless it's been agreed with your employees, or check out the award specific provisions as to how you not have an RDO system, then you should assume that you need to be complying with rostered days off and providing those to your employees. So question 9 is, what is payable on termination? So on termination of employment, there are a number of entitlements that must be paid to an employee. So it will depend on whether an employee is full-time, part-time or casual, their length of service, their age, the relevant award, and the state that the employee is located in. So generally, entitlements that may be paid on termination will of course include any unpaid wages or salary, payment in lieu of notice if you dismissed the employee, and if you haven't gotten them to work their notice out, and that may be, they may have additional notice requirements if they're over the age of 45 and have had 2 years service with you. There may be redundancy pay payable. Now, particularly in the building and construction industry, a specific redundancy scheme, an industry-specific redundancy scheme, may apply. And it may apply even if they weren't actually made redundant. It may be payable even if an employee resigns. So we do have to be very careful about industry-specific redundancy schemes. You may have to pay accrued annual leave, and of course any annual leave loading, as we discussed. Now, sick leave is not payable, and you do not have to pay that out under the award. And of course, we've got possibilities of long service leave or prorated long service leave, depending on their length of service in the state that you're located in, and any unused rostered days off. Okay, so question 10 is what safety documentation am I required to have? So in the construction industry, safe work method statements, or SWMs, as they're typically known, are generally required before high-risk construction work starts. SWMs needs to account for the circumstances at the workplace that may affect in which the high-risk construction work is carried out. It includes an understanding of the nature of the work and the workers involved and the environment itself. The generic SWMs can be prepared and used for high-risk construction work that's carried out on a regular basis, but you do need to revise these accordingly and ensure that it takes into account specific hazards and risks of each of your projects. It is the responsibility of a person conducting a business or undertaking, or a PCBU, to prepare the SWMs and ensure it has been prepared before any high-risk construction work starts. And you may find that even with applying for project work, the head contractor will usually ensure that those have been provided and account for the high-risk work that's going to be done on that site before you'll be able to start work at that site. Okay, so there are our main questions that we go through, and that we see most days here regarding to the construction and business industry. So, Employsure, what we do is that we actually sorry, can everyone hear me? I'm on mute. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Alison. I think you can hear me just because my computer was telling me I'm on mute. My apologies. So how Employsure assists businesses is that we do help business to succeed by setting those real solid foundations and ensuring that you've got that foundation to be able to manage your business and comply with your compliance obligations under the Fair Work Act. We can also assist with those workplace health and safety obligations. So does anybody have any questions or that they'd like to raise, or have anything that they'd like me to try to answer for them?
We do have a couple of questions, Roseanne. The first one is from Gary. It is, if an employee leaves the company under 10 years of service, do we have to pay long service leave still at a pro-rate rate?
Yeah, okay. Look, it depends on the state legislation. A lot of the states have a pro-rata to occur at that 7-year mark, depending on the reason as to why that they left. So usually if it's that they resign, it does depend on the reasons for why they've resigned, and that would have to be checked with the legislation in the state accordingly. So it does depend on the circumstances.
Second question is from Carol. What is the best practice for working from height?
Working from height, so we would always say make sure you've got your SWMs, and I suppose that you ensure that you've got your guys, if there's any appropriate licenses that they require, depending on the work that they're actually doing. It does depend on the work, because if they're at heights, you might need railing, you might need guarding, you might also need people to have harnessing. It does just depend on the actual work and what they're doing.
Our next question is from Rosalind. What are my obligations as an employer when it comes to heat management?
The heat management, again, it may depend on from award to award. Some awards will actually outline what may be considered extreme heat, and as to whether it's to the point that it would actually have to shut the site down. Some awards will be very specific as to when, you might have to stop work for a period of time until it gets in between a certain temperature. And it does just, again, it depends on the award. But also, if you're dealing with unions on site, they may have different policies in which they believe should be put into place on site. And I suppose it does then depend on how much that you want to work with the union as to, ensuring that it's safe for your employees to work in there, in those conditions. Because I think you've got to assess it for the actual particular site. But there are some guidelines within awards depending on the actual heat and the temperature on that site.
The next question is from Todd. How should I manage extended personal leave?
Look, it's a difficult one with extended personal leave because we are dealing with an entitlement, so we have to be careful of any general protections risk. And depending on the reason for the personal leave, we may also have some concerns regarding anti-discrimination risk when it comes to disability, or if we're looking at carers leave instead, possibly family responsibility and those things. So it does depend on the circumstances, unfortunately, because it's always a different response every way. But if you're looking at purely someone's being sick, we most certainly would always recommend keeping in communication with your employee, finding out those reasons as to why, and what's going on, and how you can assist with that. It does really depend on the reasons for the extended personal leave as to whether we're talking about over a year, they're taking a lot of little days, so there's a pattern of absence, whether we're dealing with an injury, or if it's a workplace injury. There's many different ways in which you could deal with it, and it will depend on the reasons for those absences.
Our next question is from Michelle. If an employee leaves before 7 years, but after 5 years, are they entitled to receive any long service leave occurred under the new legislation in Victoria?
So leaves before 7, but after 5?
It was leave before 7, but after 5.
Okay. Let's go to have a look in regards to Victoria themselves, because you are right, the legislation has just recently changed. So what we might do is with that one, because I always, given it's a very specific question about a specific state, and I'd always like to have a look at the Act, what I might do is I might come back to that one at the end, or one of our employment relations advisors may be able to assist after this. I'm just not sure how many questions we've got to get through, if that's okay.
Our next question is from Tanya. The portable long service leave you mentioned that you have to register with the state-based regulator. Which states are covered by this?
Again, I'd have to look at it state by state. I know that there's portable long service leave in the construction industry for Queensland. There's portable long service leave in New South Wales and Victoria. But I would have to check regarding South Australia, Western Australia, and Northern Territories.
Our next question is from Michelle. Can you have an employee on a salary based on a 40-hour week, not an award, or workplace agreement?
If we're talking about a written contract of employment, you most certainly can have an employee on a 40-hour week. if they're non-award covered, because the National Employment Standards does outline that all employees have an entitlement to a 38-hour week, but it does also say any reasonable and additional necessary hours. So you can put in a contract that they're doing 40 hours, and the salary would be reflective of that. If they're not award covered, it's a pretty. You have to ensure that you pay above the minimum wage.
You have no more questions for that?
Okay. What I'm just going to do is I'm just going to go back to that long service leave question for Victoria and see whether I can get the answer all on the phone. Okay. I'm just having a look at the legislation. When it comes to long service leave, we always go to the legislation every time because each state has different provisions.
Roseanne, we just have another question from Steve. If I, the employer, am not on site, whose responsibility is it to look after any apprentices on site?
Oh, that's actually a good question, because if your apprentices for your own business, if they're employed by you, you are obligated to supervise the apprentice. So I suppose the issue that becomes is if something happens, it is always going to be your responsibility because that person should have been supervised. Unless you've got some kind of agreement for somebody else to supervise it, it's usually not appropriate that somebody else from another company would be supervising your apprentice. It does also depend on, if they're in their 4th year, there should still be supervision. There has recently been a case regarding an electrical apprentice, and particularly in that case, it was made very clear that given the high risk nature of that work, that electrical apprentices should always be supervised. So it would be your obligation as their employer to ensure that they are supervised by somebody who's qualified.
All right. Thank you, Roseanne, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending the webinar. This event has been recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all registrants in the coming days, along with a copy of the webinar slides. If you haven't done so already, please fill out our survey, which is on your screen now. We thank you in advance for your feedback and wish you a good afternoon.